It was utterly silly for me to feel like that, getting prickles along my spine because it was just after dark, and I was going into an empty house and stay there. All by myself, in the nasty dark. You dope, Danny Gumbo, I thought. I stopped at the gate and took a look around at the neighborhood. It wasn't much of a neighborhood. Just old houses and all dark. If they were occupied, people went to bed early out here. I took another gander at the house and didn't particularly like it. It had a mottled, leprous look, because the dim light from the street lamp on the corner passed through the bars, and dead trees in the front yard made stripes and blotches of shadow. Before I went into the house, I made a round trip of the outside. I found that the back door was closed and locked, and all the windows were closed. There wasn't any garage or shed out back. Just a high wooden fence at the alley edge of the backyard. Inside, there was a hallway leading back to a staircase, and just before the staircase were doorways opening to rooms on either side. The doorway on the left was a double one, with an old-fashioned sliding door, now shoved back into the wall. I took a look around that room first, because that was the one in which I was to spend the night. It was just an empty room as far as I could see. I looked around the rest of the house and didn't see anything out of the way. Just 8 empty rooms. There was a door that looked as if it might lead up to an attic, but it was locked, and my key didn't fit. Well, my instructions hadn't been to search the house, anyway, just to spend the night in it, downstairs. I went back down and got set for my vigil. I'd had sense enough to bring a newspaper to sit on, so I spread it out on the bare floor and sat down. I turned off my flashlight, because the batteries wouldn't last if I kept it going all night. I sat there for an hour, and nothing happened. Every once in a while a train went by along the tracks just beyond the alley, and the whole house shook. Another hour went by, and I was almost beginning to hope something would happen. This was an easy way to earn $20, but if I ever took another assignment like this, I thought, I would bring a thermos bottle of Java, extra flashlight batteries, and a good book. Or a blonde. I stood up to stretch and yawned. It was the kind of yawn where you have to make a noise, low and loud and completely beyond control. Then, with startling suddenness, there was a sound as if the house were falling down. It wasn't a train this time. It was a noise that came from the stairs. Yanking the flashlight out of my pocket, I flicked it on and threw its beam through the big double doorway. I must have been pretty quick, because the guy was still falling when I got the light on him. He ended up with his head on the floor of the hallway and his feet still on the bottom step of the stairs and lay there, limp and quiet, as though he were dead. He was dead, all right, because when I got there and put my hand where his heart ought to be beating, it wasn't. If that final crack I'd heard had been his head hitting against the floor, there wasn't any wonder about that. There was a strong smell of cheap whiskey, the kind that's peddled around the streets for 2 bits a pint. And the concrete jungles was where he'd come from, there wasn't much doubt about that. His clothes were worn and dirty misfits, and his grayish hair was matted and unkempt. One side of his face was ugly and swollen with a bruise that couldn't have come from this fall. Aside from that, his face was pasty gray. Obviously, a bum. But a corpse is a corpse, the law being no respecter of persons, and I'd have to notify the police about this one. I wasn't feeling any too cheerful as I went out and searched for a place where cell service worked. Death is death, even if it's only a drunken bum who's killed himself. Anyway, I thought, maybe I'd found the answer to the haunted house angle. If the homeless used it as a boarding house, that might account for the noises and lights, if it was on a basis of noises and lights that this house had got its reputation. Powell hadn't told me. I'd rather that you went there without any preconceptions. Imaginative people sometimes see what is not there, he'd said. I'm not imaginative, Mr. Powell, I'd cut in. He smiled. Even unimaginative people sometimes tend to see and hear things they expect to see and hear, you understand? I see what you mean, I told him, but I don't agree. In my own case, I mean. A private detective doesn't do any dreaming. Even a private detective. I've talked this over with Mr. Wagner, our chairman, and he agrees. Anyway, what have you to gain by knowing what to expect tonight in the way of, manifestations? Nothing, I'd admitted. It took 10 minutes to reach the high point of a hill that lined up my cell signal with a tower. The house was in a dead zone. Or maybe it's the ghosts, I sniffed. Then I remembered the reason I trekked out here and realized maybe there might be a new ghost in the mix. After I'd made the call, I started back the 6 or 7 blocks to the house. The nearest squad car would be notified by radio, I figured, and if it was in the neighborhood, it would probably be there before I got back. It was. There was a police car parked in front. Blocks away, I heard the siren of the police ambulance coming. Inside the house, I could see flashlights moving around, one upstairs and one downstairs. The man upstairs must have heard my footsteps, for he threw up a window and leaned out, throwing the beam of his flashlight on me as I walked through the gate. "Danny Gumbo," he called out. His face was in the shadow, but the voice was that of Sergeant Caraway. "What the hell you doing here?" "I put in the call, Sarge," I called back. "I saw the guy fall down the stairs." "What guy?" he asked. From the tone of his voice I knew he wasn't ribbing me, but just the same I went on into the house on the double. The body wasn't there. Sergeant Caraway came downstairs with a funny look on his face, and another officer, one I didn't know, showed up from the room I'd been sitting in up to a half hour, or less, ago. "He was lying right there," I said and pointed out the spot. "And I saw him fall. Or anyway, I saw him land." "Sure he was dead?" asked the man I didn't know. "Sure, I'm sure," I said. I put 2 fingers on his neck and everything. His heart wasn't beating. He looked dead. "You an expert on the subject?" I couldn't tell if he was ribbing me or if he was a 24/7 jerk-off. Since I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, sometimes, I kept my mouth closed. Caraway was still looking at me with that goofy expression. "You wouldn't be kidding us, would you, Gumbo?" he said. "Not about this," I said. "If it was a joke, why would I come back after calling it in?" "I suppose you had business here?" I nodded. "And my client had permission from the owner of the house for me to use it. I had a key." I showed it to him. The ambulance was stopping out in front. "Walt," Caraway said to the other policeman, "go tell them it's a false alarm." Then he said to me, "Gumbo, you'll have to go down to headquarters with us to make a report of this. And it ain't going to do your rep any good. What were you looking for here tonight?" "Ghosts," I told him. I even kept my face straight doing it. His eyes narrowed a little. "If you know this place is haunted," he said, "didn't you know that the ghost is supposed to be that of a bum who fell downstairs here 15 years ago?" "No, I didn't know that," I said. "All right, so we'll go into headquarters. But first, is it okay if I take another look around this place, inside and out?" "Sure. Take your time, and we'll help you." I heard the ambulance drive away, and the cop named Walter came back in. We went over the house thoroughly, even going up into the attic this time, as Caraway had a skeleton key that opened the door. We looked outside in the yard and a block each way in the alley. Then I went back again and checked on whether the windows could be opened from the outside. Several of them could be. Someone could have got in easily enough. Getting out would have been easier, for I hadn't locked the front door when I went to phone. We got into the squad car and drove downtown. Of course, Captain Baker was on duty. That was my luck. I'd tangled with Baker before, and he was going to make the most of this. He was grinning before Caraway got halfway through his story. Then he wiped off the grin and glowered at me, pretending he wasn't enjoying it. "What's your side of it, Gumbo?" He scowled. I told him. I'll admit it sounded rather incredible here at headquarters. "And just what were you doing there?" he asked. "I don't think my client will have any objection to my telling," I said. "But can I phone him first? I'd like to be sure." He scowled and growled for a few minutes but then nodded, and I went out into the hall for some privacy. I looked up Powell's home number in my contacts and called it. He sounded sleepy and annoyed when he answered, but when I told him the story, he was wide awake. "All right. Sure," he said, "tell the police anything they want to know. Then come on around here. I'll wait up." I went back into Captain Baker's office. "It's okay," I told him. "I was hired by the Psychic Research Society. Or, by Mr. Norman Powell, acting for the society. I was to spend the night in that house, 2134 Green Street, and report on anything that happened, if anything did." Baker chuckled. "And you say Powell didn't tell you the history of the house?" "No. He told me I'd be less likely to imagine things if I didn't know the details. I gathered from Powell that he hadn't considered this much of a job in itself, but he put me on it as a test of my nerve, or nerves. He had other work in mind." "What kind of other work?" "The society, I hear it was organized recently to do a lot of investigating, fake mediums and reported phenomena of any sort. They expect to use a private detective. Me, I hope." Powell said they needed a man who wasn't afraid of ghosts and bogies, who wasn't superstitious. I'm not, and I didn't see a ghost tonight. A bum did fall down those stairs. The only answer is that I was mistaken in thinking he was dead. Can't you tell whether a guy's dead or not? I thought I could. Come to think of it, I still think he was dead. Give us a description of the guy. We'll make a check of the hospitals and the morgue, just in case. I gave him as good a description as I could. Baker jotted it down. Feeling like a fool, I made my escape. 2. Fortunately, Mr. Powell's place was only a dozen blocks from headquarters, so I walked. He had turned on the porch light and must have heard my footsteps, for he opened the door for me before I reached it. He led me into a small room, obviously a den. Sit down, Gumbo, he said and picked up a decanter. Like a highball, strong or medium? Sorry, I told him, but when I'm working, I never drink. Admirable. But let's consider that you're through working for now. Wouldn't it be rather anticlimactic for you to go back there tonight? I grinned. All right, but don't make it too strong. I am going back there after we've finished talking. I want to look around again and take my time at it. What would you expect to find? I don't know, Mr. Powell. I took the drink he handed me and sipped it appreciatively. But I'm going to look through the house thoroughly, and I'm going to walk a bit both ways along the tracks, particularly toward the yards. That fellow went somewhere. Are you sure? Am I sure? Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, I'm sure. I don't believe in the supernatural. You gave me only the rough story over the phone, he said. Tell me everything that happened, from the time you entered the house. I did, talking slowly, trying to remember every little detail as well as I could. When I finished, he asked. Was a train going by at the time you heard his fall? I thought a minute. I believe one had just gone by, but the sound had died away by the time he fell. The noise was startling and it came out of a silence. Then he could have entered and gone upstairs while that train was passing, and you wouldn't have heard. I wouldn't have heard unless he'd been pretty noisy about it. The tracks are just back of the house, and the whole place shook whenever a train passed. But if he'd walked around upstairs just before he actually fell, you'd have heard that. The train had gone on. He must have stood still there at the head of the stairs, for a minute or two. At any rate, during the time between the train's passing and the, dying away of the sound. I nodded. That seems in line, I said. He was probably drunk, possibly ill, as well. After negotiating the stairs, he could have stood a minute at the top, feeling dizzy or faint, unable to go on, and then fallen. Exactly. But now the more serious difficulty. Your, diagnosis of death. How sure were you? I was plenty sure, I said. I put my hand inside his shirt to find out whether his heart was beating. Was the skin warm or cold to the touch? I don't know. I didn't touch his skin. He was wearing a slip-over undershirt, so I didn't try to get my hand inside it. But I checked for a pulse on his neck and then held my hand right over where his heart should have been beating, and I held it there long enough to be sure. You don't concede that you might have made a mistake? After all, you were startled. From his appearance and from the way he lay, you probably assumed he was dead. And the beating of a man's heart, particularly a faint beating, isn't something that thumps his chest up and down. It could be missed, especially if one didn't expect to find it. The doorbell rang. Powell stood up. I phoned Zach Wagner and waked him, too. He said he'd drop around. Please excuse me. I groaned mentally at the thought of going over the whole story again. First, Carraway, then Baker, then Powell, and now Wagner. But I didn't really mind so much, because I was glad of the chance to meet Wagner. He was the head of the psychic research group, and although Powell had hired me tentatively, he had given me to understand that whether or not I got the real job, a permanent assignment, depended on how their chairman, Zach Wagner, liked my work. Mr. Wagner's opinion of me would make the difference between $20 for one night's work or a lot of invoices from now on. The Psychic Research Society wasn't a penny ante outfit. It had only a dozen or so members and only half that many active ones. But the members, mostly, were prominent businessmen who could afford to gild their hobby horse. Wagner was an attorney, Powell was the owner of a department store. Stan Koch was an oil millionaire who, I'd heard, had been made a sucker of by several fake mystics and who had recanted his superstitions and was now helping expose as many fakers as he could find. Those three I knew of, and one other, who wasn't a businessman. I'd never heard of Goldman, but he had a reputation as a no-nonsense sort. Goldman was retired now, but he still interested himself in exposing mediums and duplicating their tricks, in the Houdini tradition. Powell came back with Wagner, a big, slow-moving man, who looked stupid until you caught his eyes. He introduced us, and Wagner held out his hand. "I suppose Norman has pumped you dry, but can you stand telling it again?" I grinned. "My time is yours. You're paying for it." I let Powell talk me into having a second drink before I began. The story was easier to tell this time. Practice had made me perfect. It was 3 o'clock by the time they got through with me. Wagner had come in his car, and when he learned that I intended to go back to the house on Green Street, he dropped me off there on his way home. He asked me to report to him at his office whether or not I found anything of interest. I went through the house and the yard with a fine-tooth comb and didn't find a thing. That struck me, before I'd finished the search, as being odd in more ways than one. I mean that I had assumed, from the presence of the hobo, that tramps had known the house was empty and had used it. But certainly they would have left some traces, and there were none. It was getting light in the east by the time I finished. I went out into the alley, had a fruitless look from one end of it to the other, and then climbed over the wire fence that separated the alley from the railroad property. I walked on into the jungles. I saw a few homeless huddled around fires, indistinct features wrapped in layers of ratty clothing. They were cooking their breakfast around a common fire. None of them even remotely resembled the man I had seen last night. I walked around the end of a string of reefers, and there, sitting on the coupling of the last one, was a man I recognized. Shorty was a panhandler who had been around town longer than I had and who knew the underside of it better than he knew the palm of his hand. It wasn't easy for anyone to overlook him, as they often did the denizens of the street. Shorty was 6.5 feet tall. His eyes lighted up when he saw me and he waved. "Say, Mr. Gumbo," he said, "can you spare a buck?" "Sure," I said. I handed him a 5. "Shorty, I'm looking for a guy. Just for information. He isn't wanted." And I gave the best description I could. Shorty thought a minute, and then shook his head. "Didn't see a guy like that." "Shorty," I said, "there's a house just north of the tracks, about 6 blocks out that way." I described it. "Sure," he said. "That joint's haunted." "What about it? Anybody ever go there to camp?" His eyes got wide. "You kidding me, Mr. Gumbo? Sheesh, nobody would go any nearer that place than the tracks." "Okay. Listen, if you see the guy I described, drop around and let me know. It's worth a Benji if you do." He nodded his lined face and gave a snaggletooth grin. He would keep an eye out for a gray-haired tramp with a bruised face, all right. A Benji would be a fortune for him. I went home and slept till noon, and then waked myself up with a cold shower. I decided to stop in at my own office before going to see Zach Wagner. Not that there was likely to be anything of importance awaiting me there, but there might be something. The office, incidentally, is only half mine, although my name is the only one on the door, and I pay all the rent. The explanation is Beck Sharp. Beck Sharp is a screwball. I had known Beck for a long time, and we liked each other, maybe because we were pretty much opposites. Beck's a mystic and writes books about it. I don't mean he claims to be a medium or gazes into crystals. But it's his hobby, and he has a small income, so it doesn't matter if most of his books aren't published and if the ones that do see print don't sell many copies. Beck had suggested that the desk in my outer office would be an ideally secluded spot for him to do his writing, and in exchange for the use of it, he would answer my telephone and make a noise like a secretary. That suited me fine. It suited him fine too. He was right about it being a secluded spot. He had been answering an average of 1 phone call a day, which isn't heavy labor to exchange for the use of an office to write in. But my first real break, just yesterday, had come through Beck. He knew a few members of the society, and when he had learned that they intended to use professional help in their investigations, he had recommended me and talked Powell into giving me a crack at the job. Beck looked up when I walked into the office, beaming at me through his thick spectacles. "I've been hoping you'd come in, Gumbo," he said. "Tell me about it." "How much did Powell tell you?" I asked. "Powell? I haven't seen Powell. All I know is what was in the news." I stood there, stunned, for a minute. The news? I hadn't thought of the news and what they would do with a story like last night's. But where had they got it? Surely, Powell or Wagner wouldn't have given it to them. The Psychic Research Society didn't go in for publicity, and surely they wouldn't give the papers a half-baked, unproved story like that. Then I remembered the way Captain Baker had grinned, and I had all the answer I needed. I groaned. I saw the papers laying on Beck's desk and grabbed for them. Both morning papers and the city edition, which comes out at noon, of one of the afternoon sheets. I didn't have to hunt for it in any of them. Editors' minds must run in similar channels, for it was a box story on the front page of each of them. One of them was headed, Detective vs. Ghost. Another exploited, Mystery of the Vanishing Corpse. The third headline said, Seamus stalks Spectre. Tell me all, Beck begged. Shut up, Beck. The Fourth Estate had really gone to town on that story. It was a joke, the way they told it. A joke, that is, to everybody but me. From now on, maybe the psychic research bunch would use my services, but nobody else in his right mind would. Give me a minute, Beck, I said, and dug my cell phone out of my pocket. I called the morgue and the 4 hospitals that took emergency cases, and I drew 5 blanks. No jaundice brought in, drunk or injured, or both. Another call told me that Wagner wasn't in his office. Should I go wait, or do I go to his home? I mused to myself and got an answer from Beck. His home. Listen, Danny, about this manifestation. Can you tell me about it? All right, I gave in. I'll tell you. But let's eat while we talk. I haven't had breakfast, and you say you haven't had lunch. So, over eggs and coffee, I had to tell the story once more. 3. There was a call for you, Beck said. Stan Koch wants to see you this afternoon. I whistled. The oil millionaire. Don't tell me, had he read the papers? I suppose so, Beck said. He's a member of the society and he'd be interested. More interested than most of them because he's less skeptical than most. You know him, Beck? Not me, Danny. I don't move in such exalted circles. I know Powell and Wagner and Goldman, and that's all. But I made an appointment for you to see Koch at 4 o'clock. Is that okay? Sure, I said. Has he got an office? An hour later, at Wagner office, his secretary told me to go right in. Zach Wagner frowned when he saw me. He shook hands with all the cheerfulness of an undertaker. Gumbo, he said, I'm afraid we won't be able to use you anymore. Not for a long time, anyway. I didn't quite get it. I'm sorry if you don't like my work, Mr. Wagner. It's not your work, at all, Mr. Gumbo. It's the publicity. You've seen the papers, haven't you? Our group doesn't like publicity at all, and publicity of that kind, well. Oh, I said. It ties up with us. We want whatever investigator we use to remain undercover and not be known as a detective working for us. I'm sorry it happened. It's partly my fault, I'll admit. If it had occurred to me, we might have stopped that story. But you didn't tell us you had seen any reporter. I didn't. But I should have guessed that Captain Baker would give them the story. I stopped, because there wasn't any use in bellyaching over what an ass Baker had been. Maybe a few months from now, Wagner said, when this is blown over, we'll be able to throw some work your way. Incidentally, you can bill us for 2 days instead of 1. Powell wants to talk to you again, and Stan Koch wants to get the story from you firsthand, too. He smiled. So it's only fair, since we're taking up your full time today, practically, for us to pay you for it. Thanks, I said, because $200 is good and it would pay the office rent for another 2 weeks. I told him about my talk with Shorty and about my search of the Green Street house. Finally, I stood up to leave, and then thought of something. By the way, I said, if Shorty does find out who that fellow was, I mean, if I can prove to the police that I wasn't seeing things and that a man really did fall down those stairs, does that change the picture any? He thought it over a minute. I believe it would, partially, at least. I'll promise that the newspapers will eat the words of those stories they printed today, and that will put you and the society in quite a different light. After I left Wagner office, I phoned Powell and made an evening appointment. Then I splurged on an Uber out to the expensive suburb where Stan Koch's home was located. I had thought butlers existed only in the movies, but a real butler let me into the Koch mansion and took my hat. Mr. Koch is expecting you, he said. He's in. But Koch beat him to it by popping out of a doorway down the hall, much as a mouse would pop out of a hole. He looked like a mouse, too. I don't know just why. It wasn't his size, for he was of average height and build. Maybe it was because of his eyes. They were small and shiny, like shoe buttons. And his manner was quick and furtive, fearful. "You Danny Gumbo?" he said. "My study's here. Come on in." He pulled up a chair for me with jerky movements, and then sat down on the edge of the desk. "Powell told me about your experience," he said. "I know the facts about it. I want your opinion." "My opinion about what?" "The significance of what happened, of course. Was it or was it not a psychic experience?" "It was not," I said. "But how can you be so sure?" "Because," I told him, "I don't believe in psychic experiences. There is a possible physical explanation, so I accept it." "So you're a skeptic," he said. "Would you care to earn $500, Gumbo?" I admitted that I would. "It's worth that to me to know what really happened last night. If you can prove one way or the other what happened, I'll pay you that." "1." I looked at him curiously. $500 is a lot of money to pay out just to satisfy your curiosity. Then I remembered it wasn't much for him. $500 meant as much to Koch as 5 cents meant to me, and I'd sure give a nickel myself for that information. I grinned at him. "I'll try," I said, "but it doesn't seem too good a chance. If that dead man's still in town, I might find him, but if he took the next freight out, then I haven't much hope. I take it that producing the gentleman in question would constitute proof." "Adequate proof, yes, if your experience was a physical one. And if it wasn't, I'm just asking out of curiosity, because I can't believe that it wasn't. How the devil would I prove it?" "Bring the ghost here?" He smiled, but I couldn't tell whether there was humor in the smile or not. "I imagine that the fact that you wouldn't be able to bring it would prove the fact to you," he said. "You're suggesting that I repeat my stay at the house and see if somebody falls down the stairs again?" And if the same guy falls down again, I could sit on his chest and yell for help instead of leaving him. If he vanishes out from under me, he's a ghost. That the idea? It sounds absurd when you put it that way, I'll admit. And if I became convinced, through another experience, that it was a ghost, you'd take my word for it? I would. I took the trouble to investigate you, Mr. Gumbo, before I phoned your office. I'm convinced that you are honest and sincere. I hope you'll forgive me for investigating you. I laughed. Detectives are so used to investigating other people that it wouldn't occur to one to feel hurt because someone investigated him. Fewer con men would make fortunes if investigations were more common. "Exactly," said Koch. He hesitated before speaking again. "I must admit that I have been victimized myself in the past. Several mystics from whom I have taken advice turned out not to be disinterested. By the way, is the Society going to use you in further investigations of Joyce Steiner?" "Who is Joyce Steiner?" "A most remarkable medium and extremely attractive one. Norman Powell found her. Incidentally, something she told me makes me particularly interested in what happened last night." "Something she told you? What?" "Several days ago she told me that an experience someone else was going to have would have a profound effect on my life." I didn't get it. I just looked at him. "Don't you see? Frankly, I have been wavering in my belief in the supernatural. It is difficult fully to credit phenomena in seances. But an unusual experience like yours, it would weigh a lot with me to be convinced beyond doubt that you really saw an apparition." Sucker, I thought. No wonder Koch had been victimized if he was as gullible as all that. A vague statement. An experience someone else is going to have soon will have a profound effect on your life. Anything could be made to fit a vague prediction like that. I went downtown, phoned the hospitals and morgue again, without luck, and then went to Norman Powell's place to keep my appointment. Powell, it turned out, merely wanted a full account of what I had done after I left his house the night before, and most of what I told him was just a repetition of my talk with Koch. I didn't leave Powell until 11. I let him think I was going home. I thought that the fewer people who knew I was going back to the house on Green Street, the better. I got there, and there was the house with its scabrous front of peeling gray paint, further mottled by the tree's shadow. A dead house and a dead tree. I hesitated with one foot on the first step of the porch steps when I remembered that I hadn't brought a flashlight with me. Nothing was going to happen here tonight, I told myself, so why go in at all? Why not go home and catch up on sleep? At any rate, I told myself, I wouldn't accomplish anything here tonight. I wouldn't be able to search the place and I would be at a disadvantage if anything did happen. But what could happen, unless another manifestation of the supernatural? Another? I asked myself. What do you mean, you dope, by another? In spite of calling myself names, I was a bit afraid to go in. That's why I went. It doesn't do to give way to yourself in something like that. If you give in once, you're sunk. The door wasn't locked. I didn't need the key, which was still in my pocket. I tiptoed down the hall toward the stairs. Don't ask me why I tiptoed. It was not because I thought anyone was there. If anyone had been there, they would have heard me, anyway. I got to the foot of the stairs. "Hello, Danny," a voice said in the semi-darkness. I didn't shriek. Not too loud, anyway. "Beck," I exclaimed. "What the hell are you doing here?" He laughed in the darkness. "I had a hunch you'd show up here." "Beck," I said, "I didn't know I was coming here myself until late this afternoon. What made you so darn sure I'd come?" "Don't talk so loud, Danny. Come in here and sit down. Matter of fact, we mustn't talk at all, after a while. Silence is almost as important as darkness. I'm hoping there will be a manifestation tonight." "Horse hockey," I said. "There aren't any, oh, skip it. A haunted house isn't the place to get into an argument about haunted houses," I thought. "But you didn't answer my question," I said. "What made you think I'd come here?" "Just a hunch," said Beck. "I didn't come here to meet you, Danny. I'm expecting other company." "Other company?" I echoed blankly. For an instant I thought he meant the ghost. "Goldman," said Beck, as though that explained everything. "The magician?" "Yes. Have you met him yet?" "No," I said. "The psychic research members I've met thus far are Powell, Wagner, and Stan Koch." "Goldman's smarter," said Beck. "Powell and Wagner aren't fools, but Goldman has methods which they lack. He knows the tricks of the trade inside out. He's exposed dozens of mediums." "The devil you say. You admire him for that when you say you believe in mediums?" "Don't be an ass, Danny. Because I believe in psychic phenomena doesn't mean I believe in fake mediums as well as real ones. And there are probably 100 fakes to every known genuine one." "By the way," I said, "if Goldman is coming here, how'd you know I wasn't he?" Beck laughed. "Because of the noise you made tiptoeing around. Goldman would either walk openly, or I wouldn't have heard him at all. He said he'd be late." Then, as abruptly as it had happened last night, the house fell down again, or seemed to. Bump, thud, bump, bang. Something was falling down the stairs. I jumped up and I heard Beck gasp and get to his feet, too. "Have you got a light?" I asked. But by that time Beck had it on, and its spot, feebler than the bright light I'd the night before, shone through the double doorway and on the thing that lay at the foot of the stairs. It was a body. Again. I ran toward it, and so did Beck. Then, a yard away from it, I put out my hand to stop Beck. "Wait," I said. "That's not a man, that's a wax figure." There was a chuckle from down the hall. "Your eyesight is very good, my young friend," said a voice that was not Beck's. Beck turned the flashlight that way. "Hello, Goldman," he said. I'd have taken him for the devil, myself. He had the face and the build for it, as well as the voice and the clothes. A black top hat and black magician's cape. He was tall and slender and had a long, thin face with a pointed chin. There was a devilish grin on his face. He stood so straight that you didn't realize he was old until you noticed that his hair was pure white. "And you're Danny Gumbo, then?" he said. "Koch told me you'd be here, so I came along." "Just a minute," I said. "This dummy never fell down the stairs. The wax would have cracked." He chuckled again. "Beck was right about you, Gumbo. You do think quickly. No, it didn't fall down the stairs. I placed it there. The sound of the fall is a recorded sound effect. I played it on a speaker around the corner." "But why?" I wanted to know. "What's it all about?" He strolled forward toward us, and I noticed that the thick crepe rubber soles of his shoes made no sound at all. "To eliminate a possibility, Mr. Gumbo, I hope you'll forgive me. But I wanted to be sure that no one had played a practical joke on you last night." "It wasn't any dummy I saw and touched last night if that's what you mean," I said. "That's what I meant, and I believe you now. Not only did you spot the deception before you came within reach of it, but you kept your head enough to realize that, being wax, it could not have fallen and remained intact. Anyone would have thought of that, wouldn't they?" "Later, yes. Not at once. Was your flashlight in good condition?" "Brighter than Beck's," I said. do you know any reason why someone would have wanted to, impose on me in that particular way last night? I thought he hesitated before he shook his head. We watched while Goldman moved the dummy out of the hallway. Then, using a bright flashlight of his own, he bent over to examine the floor at the foot of the stairs. I had looked there, too, but I hadn't used a magnifying glass. Goldman did. He said. Ah. Finally. I couldn't see anything there from where I stood and I bent closer. He handed me the glass and pointed to a spot. I knelt beside him and looked. There were a few grains of a white powder. With infinite care, Goldman gathered what he could of them into a tiny envelope. I asked what he thought it was. I don't know, he said, but I'll guess. Talcum powder. I'll show it to a chemist tomorrow. Talcum powder? I thought hard. But bums don't use talcum. Unless, Goldman, did the original tramp who died here have gray hair? The magician grinned. He did, my boy, he did. Our minds, I see, are running in the same channel. Maybe they did, I thought, but mine didn't run very far. If someone had wanted the bum of last night to fit whatever description of the original one was recorded, then talcum powder could easily turn dark hair gray. But why? If Goldman had any idea about that, he was miles ahead of me. You think the body I found last night was made up to resemble that man who died here? To the extent of the hair, yes, I've checked into the records, and no photograph was taken of that body. I don't imagine any actual makeup was used. If it was, I think there'd be traces of grease paint here as well as powder. Beck came over to join us. Goldman, he said, did someone powder that fellow's hair, or did he do it himself? We'll ask him, Goldman said. Beck's eyes widened. I hadn't thought of that. Goldman, that suggestion from you. I thought you didn't believe in the supernatural. The magician chuckled. I don't believe, Beck. But he might give us an answer anyway. What do you say to a séance at my place tomorrow night? Just the three of us? Beck asked. Oh, no. We'll ask any of the society members who want to come and make it a real circle. I've been promising them one, told them I'd duplicate the materialization technique Walter Atwell used to use, until I caught him at it. It will be highly educational, I assure you. You can come, Gumbo? I told him it would take a shotgun to keep me away. Nothing more happened that night. 4. The next day I chased down a few blind alleys, including a trip to the jungles to see Shorty, and then caught a few hours sleep before I looked up Beck to go to Goldman's with him. Goldman's place was a bachelor flat. He had taken all the furniture out of one room, leaving it utterly bare, except for 8 plain chairs and a small table with a speaker and a few boxes and pieces of paraphernalia in one corner. Wagner and Koch were there when I arrived, as was another member of the society whom I had not yet met and who was introduced to me as Harold Felon. Powell was the last to arrive. A few minutes later, Goldman took the floor. Gentlemen, he said, most of you were at the séance given by the medium, Atwell, at which we exposed some of his tricks. But some of you had attended previous séances of his at which I was not present. You, Mr. Koch, in particular, wanted to know how he could have achieved certain effects at those previous séances. Tonight I'll try to duplicate them and explain them afterward. Koch, I saw, was sitting on the edge of his chair, all excited attention. He watched Goldman as a mouse might watch a cat. The magician cleared his throat. We'll try to duplicate the procedure and precautions which I've been told you used at those séances. 2 of you, let's say Koch and Powell, may search me and examine my clothing, while the rest of you search the room. You brought rope to tie me with, Wagner? Zach Wagner nodded. The same rope we used on Atwell. I took a moment to swallow. These men meant business. We all went into the empty room and subdivided among us the work of examining and sealing the room. Meanwhile, Koch and Powell frisked Goldman. At Goldman's instructions, we put the speaker in a corner of the room and near it the other objects that had been on the table. I saw now that they were a speaking trumpet and tambourine. Then the table went into the center of the room and the 7 chairs in a circle about it. Wagner and Powell then tied Goldman in the armchair, using thin clothesline and tying his wrists tightly to the arms of the chair and his ankles to the legs. All but one of you sit down now, Goldman directed. You, Powell, start the speaker, then turn off the light. Be sure you can find your way to the empty chair before you push the switch. The speaker started grinding out "Lead Kindly Light," and the light switch clicked. Utter darkness. The speaker played about a minute, then stopped abruptly as though someone had lifted off the needle. The sudden silence was almost startling. Complete silence and complete blackness. Time seemed to have no existence in that void. My imagination began to play tricks. My eyes tried to make shapes out of darker splotches of darkness. And this, I thought, is an avowedly fake seance. What must be the psychological effect of the real thing upon those who believe in it? The speaker started again, taking up at just the point where it had broken off before. I heard someone whisper, "The table." And I reached forward for it. It wasn't where it should have been. I raised my hands, and the backs of them touched the bottom of it. It had evidently been made to levitate and seemed to be rocking. The tambourine in the corner rattled, and the table fell, thudding against the carpet. The speaker reached the end of lead kindly light and stopped. Somewhere in the room a bell tinkled softly. Again, utter silence and blackness for a while. Then a voice. Not Goldman's voice. It must have been his, of course, but it didn't sound like it at all. It was a rough, coarse voice, with a plaintive whine in it. "Why'd he do it to me, I ask you," it said. "Killed me, just like that. To kill a guy for nothing." "Who are you?" asked Koch's voice. "You wouldn't know my name, mister. He didn't kill me because of who I was. He just killed me. That's what gets me." The whine was stronger now. If I'd done anything, it had been different. Even if I'd had any dough to get bumped off for, then there'd be some reason, see? I was looking toward Goldman, I guess we all were, or toward the place where Goldman ought to be if he were still in the chair. There was something white in the darkness. A white, misty substance. Something that shimmered as though it were faintly luminous. It looked vaguely like a human face, not Goldman's face. Koch's voice. "Can you materialize? Can you show yourself to us?" Lord, I thought, is Stan Koch nuts? Can he be believing in this, despite the fact that he knows Goldman is putting on a show for us? Then I got the answer. They had probably been told to act as they had at the seances with the medium, Atwell. Koch must have acted as an interlocutor at those seances and was taking the same part now. "I'm tryin', mister. He killed me first, see, and then we was on the stairway to the attic. Him and me dead. When a train goes by, see? And out we come." A white shimmer that might have been a face, a shimmering blank in lit which the imagination pictured features. And at the top of the stairs, "Blamed if he don't." Then the shimmer wasn't there anymore, and the voice had stopped. My eyes strained into the darkness, and I saw, or thought I saw, a white horizontal line. A chair creaked. Then silence and blackness again. A minute or two, maybe 3 or 4. Then Beck's voice said. "Goldman?" Quietly. "Goldman, if you don't answer me, I'm going to turn on the lights." There wasn't any answer. I heard Beck's chair scrape the carpet softly, and then, as Beck walked toward the switch, Koch, Powell, and Wagner seemingly all started to talk at the same time. The light clicked on, blinding us for a second. Then I could see again. Goldman was in the chair, all right, but he was dead. Strangled. A strip of white cheesecloth was pulled tightly around his throat, the ends hanging down over the back of the chair. The piece of cheesecloth, probably slightly impregnated with some luminous dye stuff, which had been the ectoplasm of a moment ago, had been snatched out of his hand and used to garrote him. I was the first to reach him and to snatch it away. But his breath and his heart had already stopped. The rest of that night was police and questioning. It was almost dawn when they released us. Released us only because they could find no cause to suspect one of us more than they suspected another. 6 of us, besides Goldman, had been sealed in that room. Each of the 6 had equal opportunity to walk behind Goldman in the dark and strangle him with that cheesecloth, easy to see in the dark, jerked from his hand. We were released with strict orders not to leave town. But we were not placed under bond, and I gathered that the police would be only too happy to have someone confess guilt by trying to run away. Beck and I had breakfast together and read the morning papers. "Beck," I said, "I'm through in this town, anyway. My best friend wouldn't hire me to find a lost dog. I won't be able to earn enough as a detective to buy red ink to keep my accounts with." "It isn't as bad as that, Danny." "It's worse," I said. "It's worse because they're right. I'm supposed to be a detective, and what do I detect? I ought to get a job as a dishwasher or a street cleaner and do some good in the world. Don't be a ass, Danny. You're too tired to think straight. Go home and get some sleep." He was right. My eyes were dry, itchy. I imagined red-rimmed and half-closed. I went home and went to sleep. I awoke at 4 in the afternoon, and when I had taken a shower and shaved, I felt better. Something, too, was knocking at the door of my mind, something that made a noise like an idea. I sat quietly so that I wouldn't frighten it away. It was $1 million idea, maybe. The $1 million was Stan Koch's. Gumbo, I told myself, when there's a crime, it's because of money or women, and there aren't any women in this case. But there's money. Koch has millions, and he has several of them. Somebody might take a lot of trouble to separate him from one of them. With that idea, things began to make some sense. Assume that my little experience of night before last, with the vanishing corpse, had accomplished its object. What had been its results? Stan Koch had told me that he had been victimized by mystics until he wasn't sure anymore what was true in spiritualism and what wasn't. Also, my apparent encounter with an authenticated ghost had had a profound effect upon him. I had been sent as an impartial and skeptical observer by the Impartial and Skeptical Society for Psychic Research. Why wouldn't that little play have been a fattening of the fatted calf for another slaughter? 2. A medium, one Joyce Steiner, a curvaceous number with an inviting eye, as I had found out, had predicted to Koch that something of the sort would happen. So another effect was the increase of his faith in the vivacious Joyce Steiner. And who had found Joyce Steiner but the man who had sent me to that haunted house? I went quickly over to Beck's place. He was still asleep, but I dragged him out of bed. I needed to bounce this off somebody. He listened. Powell? He asked. Could be. I've heard his stores have been running in the red lately. But how would he get money from Koch? Not directly, of course. He would work through some shady stockbroker or get him interested in a promotion scheme. Look, Koch is a natural-born sucker for spooks. Once he had faith in a medium again, she could lead him around by the nose. Especially if she had what this Steiner woman has got. Said Beck. Will you play that record once more, and slowly? I sat down on the edge of his bed and went over my idea while he dressed. Powell introduces Koch to a medium named Joyce Steiner, I said. For the purpose of victimizing him through the medium's advice. But it has to be a slow build-up and with no spectacular phenomena, because if she starts throwing ectoplasm around, Goldman will be on her like a ton of bricks. Anyway, Koch is wavering. That gives Powell an idea. Suppose a duly hired skeptical investigator for the society sees a bona fide ghost that fulfills Joy's prediction and will have a profound effect on Koch. All right. It'd be the turning point for him. Probably the society had been discussing investigating that house. You recommend me to him for work, and he sends me there. But meanwhile, earlier in the evening, he went there himself and he's upstairs in the attic stairway. Around midnight, when a train's going by, he carries the corpse to the head of the stairs, and when the noise of the train has died down, he lets it tumble down the steps. Beck nodded slowly. Do you think he killed somebody just for that purpose? I don't know, I admitted. Goldman evidently figured it that way. It's possible that he obtained a corpse some other way, but Goldman might have been right. What's a bum's life compared with a crack at $1 million or so? Anyway, Goldman was near enough right to get himself killed for his pains. Beck drew in his breath slowly. If Goldman hadn't been so dramatic about his method of revealing what he knew, he'd be alive, all right. Look, Beck, I said. I handed him an evening paper I had bought on the way from my place to his. I pointed out a boxed item in the middle of the story about the Goldman murder. The heading was, Millionaire Offers Reward. The article under it, only a paragraph long, told that Stan Koch had offered a reward of $5,000 for proof that would result in the conviction of the murderer of Goldman. Funny wording, Beck said when he had read it. Not so funny, I told him, when you consider what worries Koch the most, not who killed Goldman but whether or not Goldman was killed by a human being. He offered me $500 for proof, one way or the other, whether or not it was a ghost I saw at the Green Street house. Oh, Beck sucked in his breath. Yes, he honestly thinks there's a possibility that spirits may have resented Goldman's mocking of them and taken him for a ride. And he'd give $5,000, which means less to him than $5 to us, to be sure about it. Beck, I said, how'd you like to split that reward with me? Are you willing to take a wild chance? His eyes brightened. Take a chance? Why, for half of $5,000, I'd take a chance on shooting Niagara Falls in a canoe with a leaky bottom. Do you know where Goldman kept his props? That dummy and the speaker he used night before last at the Green Street house? Beck nodded. At a stage props warehouse downtown. Could you get them? Sure. I know the man who runs the place. He'd lend them to me. All right. Here's what I want you to do, Beck. Be in the Green Street house, hid den, with that dummy and the speaker that Goldman used there, at 11 o'clock this evening. You mean you think you can get Powell there tonight and startle him into a confession or something? I can get him there, I said, through Koch. If he's guilty, having a ghost fall down those stairs is going to give him the screaming memes for a moment or so, isn't it? If I jump in with both feet at the right moment, he might talk. It might work, said Beck thoughtfully. And it might not, I admitted. But what else is a better bet? We'll be confronting him before Koch, and his reaction may convince Koch even if Powell doesn't crack. I'll have Wagner there, too, for a witness. That's figuring the angles pretty fine, Danny. You be in that house around 11 o'clock, ready to duplicate the trick Goldman pulled. I'll take care of the rest. When I left Beck, I realized that it was too early to start pulling strings for the 11 o'clock date on Green Street. I knew that Koch would cancel anything else to go there with me, and Powell and Wagner would go, too, if Koch wanted them to. But I didn't want to give Powell time to think about why I was getting him there. So I killed time until a little after 10 o'clock and then I phoned Koch. I want to collect that $500 you offered me for proof of whether or not that business on Green Street was genuine, I told him. He sounded excited. All right. Which is it, Gumbo? I stalled. I'd rather show you. Can you meet me there, and bring Powell and Wagner with you? They're interested, too. Why, yes, I can come. And I believe they will, too. I'll meet the three of you in front of the house in question at 11, or as soon after as you can all get there. All right. I'll leave now and pick up Wagner and Powell on my way. I walked from downtown to Green Street, thinking I had time to get there a few minutes early to check with Beck. But the walk took longer than I figured it would, and Koch's car, with the 3 men in it, was pulling up to the curb when I got there. But I could count on Beck, even without a checkup. He'd had 5 hours since I had left his room, plenty of time to get the paraphernalia and establish himself in the house. Again I managed to avoid answering a direct question from Koch. I led the three of them into the house and along the hallway into the room across from the foot of the stairs. I had 2 flashlights with me, a bright one and one that I had doctored down to be very, very dim. The latter was in my pocket, ready for use at the right minute. I kept the beam of my flashlight carefully away from the direction of the double doorway and the stairs beyond. Beck would be placing the dummy there now. I was talking without saying anything. And this is the room I waited in, 3 nights ago. It was just about this time that I got here, and of course I made a preliminary search of the house and then sat down. I couldn't have kept it up much longer, but I didn't have to. The crashing noise of a fall downstairs, right behind us, a familiar sound to me now, for this was the 3rd time I had heard it and I was expecting it. But the others jumped, and I pretended to jump, too, and dropped the flashlight, flicking off the switch as I let go of it. I pulled the dim flashlight out of my pocket and switched it on, swinging it around to play on the dummy that was laying at the foot of the stairs. In that dim glow, it wouldn't show up as a dummy. It wasn't one. Goldman's or any other. It was the man, the bum, the corpse I had seen there 3 nights ago when this whole ghastly mess had started. The bum whose reek of alcohol had nearly knocked me down when I had bent over him and felt for his heartbeats. The gray suit, the white hair, the huge, ugly bruise on the face. I should have been watching Powell's face, but I wasn't, because the corpse was moving. It rolled over, face down, from the sprawl in which it lay, and then began crawling toward us. With awkward motions, its dead eyes wide open and staring, it crawled, foot after foot, as though in great agony. As it crawled toward us, we all took a step backward. Koch and I were in the center, Wagner on one side, and Powell on the other. For just that frozen second before it occurred to me that Beck had bettered our idea, had used Goldman's speaker for the sound effect but had made himself up instead of using Goldman's wax figure, I was scared stiff. That idea of crawling, dragging himself toward us, was great. Only the thing on the floor wasn't crawling toward Powell. Zach Wagner was backed into the far corner of the room now. The thing was crawling toward him, inexorably. Why would Beck do that? Then I saw Wagner's face, and in it, I saw my own mistake. The crawling corpse came nearer, and Wagner screamed in terror, kept screaming. Get back. You're dead, I killed. And then, Beck and I were having early breakfast or late dinner, or something, And between us, on the table, was Stan Koch's check for $5,500. Both rewards in one neat package. Beck was pouring vinegar over his pancakes in the belief, soon to be abandoned, that it was syrup. "But, Danny," he said, "how could I have got in touch with you to tell you? I just had to go ahead." "I was goofy," I said. "I went off half-cocked. The reward ought to be all yours, instead of half." "Forget that. You solved the thing, only you picked the wrong guy. I'd never have figured out that motivation in 1,000 years. But after you left my place, I saw you were right, except that everything you laid to Powell went double for Wagner." "Sure," I said. "I can see it now. Wagner is a lawyer, handled work for Koch direct and wouldn't have to work through a third party to scam him as Powell would have had to do. Wagner has even less money than Powell, so $1 million would look even bigger to him. Also, Wagner knew that Powell was sending me to keep vigil at the Green Street house that night. As head of the society, he was on the inside. And although Powell was the one who introduced the medium, Joyce Steiner, to the group, Beck said, Wagner could have engineered that easily enough. If she was his confederate, the last thing he'd want to do would be to sponsor her himself." Beck took a bite of pancake, with vinegar, and his next remarks must remain off the record. "When things had subsided, I said. But the thing that should have made me think again is that Powell is under average size and not too husky. Wagner is a big guy. It took strength to carry that body upstairs, and it took strong hands to choke a man the way he choked Goldman at the seance when Goldman started to expose him." I sighed and said again, "Yes, Beck, I was a dope. But, thanks to you, I've got half of 5,500, let's see, that's 2,750, to back the agency. Watch my smoke from now on. Particularly with the newspapers apologizing. What are you going to do with your half?" Beck grinned. "Gumbo," he said, "I've had more fun the last 3 days than in the 10 years before then. If we leave that check in one chunk, could you use a partner?" "Could I?" I said, and I reached for the creamer and put some into my coffee. This could be the start of something. The end.